Hello. What you're listening to now is a 1933 Crosley 168 Dual 7 Cathedral. It is part of my working antique radio collection. Now, a lot of folks are talking about, well, I like antique radios and so forth, but they're kind of expensive, and I don't have a lot of space. So what do I do? I'd like very much to have an antique radio myself, just to show around and maybe listen to a ball game on our occasion. When I began this hobby back in 2002, I had the same problem myself. I asked myself, well, I'm on a limited budget, I'm a teacher, but I've always wanted an old set, so what did I do? I decided right off the bat that because I lived in a single one-bedroom apartment, quite cramped, that the only way to justify having such a collection was to make it a working one. You see, because as you can tell, even by these table models, that old radios, antique radios from the 20s and 30s, which interested me, are rather large. They're what we call space hogs. And so the only way to justify the expense in terms of money and, shall we say, the situation regarding space limitations was to have a set that I could use, that I could listen to on a regular basis. And that made me think about what type of radios I wanted. So, starting off with, I was into cathedrals. I used to look at the Little Rascals as a kid back in the late 60s, early 70s. I was always part of the wooden cathedrals. In fact, what you see here, the Philco 70 from 1931 was what I used to see on Little Rascals all the time. That's my idea of an old radio. So, of course, I had to get one of those. And what you see here, this Philco 70, and next to it, the 1930 Philco 20, both of which work. They were among the first radios, old radios, that I got. I got the Philco 20 from amradios.com, and I got the Philco 70 off eBay. I was only going to spend about $300 or $400, if that, on radios. And it was going to be spread out over a long period of time. My collection is about 12, 15 sets, but it has been accumulated over the course of a decade. And since, work wasn't steady, I basically taught a lot, did odd jobs, raking lawns and so forth. Instead of going to movies and doing other odd things, I just basically raked lawns, did housework, odd jobs for family and friends in order to get money for radios. That's how I did it. When I started, of course, I was not really familiar with radios that were battery operated. Prior to 1927, I didn't know how they could be powered. So what I'm turning on here, Atwater Kent Compact 20 from 1925, is just really not part of the equation. But I decided early on to set very specific parameters as to what type of radios that I wanted. And I, right off the bat, pretty much decided that the years I was going to focus on were going to be between 1922, if possible, and 1937. So what you have in this room here are radios from that period. Behind the candlestick phones, you have a 1922 RCA RADA, or RC, the first radio manufactured for public broadcasting purposes. Over here, you have a Radiola 3 from 1924. These radios came rather late, or about a decade into my collecting life, but I really enjoyed them. I also limited my collection to something like Tombstones and Cathedrals from the 30s. So the newest working set that I have is what you see here, a 1937 Zenith Tombstone. And I have a non-working Zenith console from 1940, which I will show in later videos. I'm not an expert. I've never really been electrically inclined, so it was never my intention to, shall we say, restore these sets. I learned basic tube restoration, how to change basic tube changing, basic line changing, and so forth, because, old radios, they have cords made of cloth that become brittle with age, and that makes them fire hazards. I also did a lot of reading on the internet with radio collectors. Ron Ramirez, who's into the Philco radio thing, he's really good, and I communicated with him via email for a little while early in the process and bought his books. And he gave me some insight as to what to expect, what to look around for. And I took his advice, and from him and some others, like collectors, I learned that it is only safe to operate these radios maybe an hour, hour and a half in duration, because to avoid overheating of the tubes and running out of capacitors and so forth. So I took it from there. And over the course of 10 years, 10, 11 years, I developed a nice little collection on limited budget and limited space. So if you want to buy a radio, what are the first things you want to consider? Well, as I said before, space, money, working and non-working collections. If you go online and you see pictures of collections, or you go to radio swap meets like at Kutztown, which happens in May and September of every year, Kutztown Antique Radio Meet, you'll find that most collectors don't really care if a set is working or not. They're into quantity versus quality. I mean, you can go online or go visit people who collect radios and see walls upon walls of their houses just filled with one set after another, all varieties. Radios from the 1920s, 30s, 40s. You can have radios made of wood, metal, or an early form of plastic called Catalin, which runs you in the hundreds if not thousands because of their rarity. They were cheap radios in their day, but Catalin radios now are so rare because there's still few left that a good Catalin radio from like around 1938, 1940 can run for $20,000. So that's part of it. That's, of course, way out of my price range and not part of the equation. So anyway, people are into this sort of thing, and it's all a matter of personal taste. Again, as you can see here in this rather confined area, I'm limited primarily to cathedrals, tombstones. I do have a Atwater Kent 40 from 1928 that I also use. When you want to get a radio, I would say that an antique store is not your best bet. An antique store, basically the people who sell antique radios at antique stores aren't really familiar with these things. They're just one of many items they sell. So if they say it's working, I'd be dubious about it. Also, there's no way of holding them accountable if they sell you a lemon. And that is very important in this endeavor, because if you buy a radio off eBay, which is what I do in most cases, or even a radio swap meet, there is a level of accountability. If someone says a radio works, odds are it's going to work, because on eBay you can send negative feedback in return for a non-working set if it's not properly represented as such, and impact their ability to sell future items. As many radio collectors as there are, it is still a rather small community. So let's say you go to a swap meet like in Kutztown or in Maryland, Maryland Antique Radio Collection Society. The collectors don't want the word getting out that they sell junk, or that they sell, another term, garbage ready sets, because that will impact their ability to buy radios and sell them in the future. And so you basically have a pretty good chance of getting it. In an antique store, they really don't make such guarantees because they don't particularly care. An antique store is basically sold as is. Buyer beware, as they say. Now, some will argue that eBay is not a good venue because you cannot necessarily see what you're getting. And that's true. And so, again, it all comes down to the fact that people have to rely on the fact that folks actually care about their reputations. Again, enough negatives and you can have an account shut down very easily. If a person sees a negative on a seller's account within the last 6 months or so, they're going to think twice about buying from that person. So it's a monetary thing. That's what keeps them honest for the most part. Likewise, at a radio swap meet, you know, you don't want to label a seller as selling junk. At a Kutztown meet, of course, you can actually see what you're getting. And, they're pretty honest guys there, women. This set right here, that I'm about to show you, is I hope the lighting is halfway decent so you can see the light on the dial, is a General Electric K50 that I got in Kutztown in September of 2011. The fellow wanted $125 for it, but he was so willing, but he was willing to mark it down to $100, and that's a great value, to say the least. What you want is a bargain, like anything else. Antique radios is about finding a bargain, and sellers are willing to be reasonable. If, in fact, they see that you're serious about collecting the thing and that you're going to take care of it, and you're not going to immediately sell it for a profit yourself. Now, what is a good source of determining what the value of a set is? The book I have here, if you can see it, is the 7th edition of the Antique Radio, Collector's Guide to Antique Radios by John Slusher and the staff of Radio Days. This is an invaluable resource as far as determining values of sets are concerned. I don't think the picture quality is going to be all that great, but you have basically hundreds, if not thousands, of sets listed here, various prices and values. The highlighted ones, of course, have the prices on them. Here you have a Philco 70, I hope, Philco 71D, Philco 90, and if you see underneath, I don't know the picture quality, which has a value ranging from $450 to $600. $600. And it's an invaluable guide. What I like about this particular book, and I'm always looking for new editions as they come out, is the fact that basically you can see a price range here. So the lower price, of course, indicates the radio as it is in non-working condition, and the higher price is the radio in working condition. I'm going back to the General Electric for a moment, have it turned on so we can have some background sound with this, and I'll be with you in a moment. I apologize for that a minute. I'm trying to show you a picture of a Philco 90 or 90B from 1931 listed in the Radio Collector's Guide, and you should see the price range as of 2006, what it runs for. Next to it is a Philco 84B, it's the later edition. There were two of them from 1934. They do two editions, different cabinets. This is the second cabinet that came out. There you can see the price here, $130 and $170. All of this is to give you some indication of the price range. Ultimately, the value of a radio is what someone was willing to pay for it. And if you're into the cathedrals or the tombstones, you're in a pretty good spot as far as value is concerned. You're looking at maybe $200 at max for a decent set. Now, suppose you want to go prior to the 1930s as I did, because I'm into the older the better as far as I'm concerned. And so right after I started collecting in the fall of late summer, early fall of 2002, I started looking around, seeing pictures of radios from the 20s. And radios were back then too, huh? Didn't look like much, but they were around, and I decided to do some exploring. At first, I saw Stuart Warner on amradios.com, and I said, this is great. But I thought the price was too high for that particular set. And somebody told me about this fellow who, if you're a radio collector, or even not a radio collector, you're quite familiar with him, Atwater Kent. Atwater Kent did in my opinion, some of the best quality radios of the 1920s and 30s imaginable. And of course, the book I'm showing you is a book on Atwater Kent called A. Atwater Kent, The Man That Manufactured His Radios, from around about 10 so years ago. I'm not sure the year. Right here, it's 2002 it came out. And I got it 2005. Shows you how behind the times I am. But it's a great book. And I'm going to show you two of my Atwater Kents that I really enjoy that I use all the time. What you have here is an Atwater Kent 40 from 1928. This is the first Atwater Kent that I got back in the fall of 2002. Prior to 1929, for the most part, radios had separate speakers. So you have here to the left with the dials, you have the radio itself, 1928, and you have here what I think is an E2 or E3 speaker, external speaker attached to it. Now this was AC. It's plugged in. It has about 7 or 8 tubes. And the thing about an Atwater Kent is they were so well built that odds are when you buy one, it's going to be working off the bat. Of all the old radios I've seen around, Atwater Kents have been the most reliable in terms of being dormant for many years and working looking great upon being plugged in. I just moved up to I think I may have shown you this earlier before. It's my 1925 Atwater Kent 20C and the 1925 and the model L4 speaker from 1924. Great sound. This one is restored. It has a modern speaker in the base of it, and but the sound is good. Nobody can really tell the difference. Some still have the original diaphragm, and that's a good sound quality too. Now, as to this radio, how does it work? Because the Atwater Kent from this period was battery operated. You had like 3 or 4 different batteries for power the tubes, the filaments of the tubes, the capacitors and so forth. One is as big as a car battery. So how is this radio powered with a regular AC? And the answer is right here. What you see here is an RB3 battery eliminator. Now these things can be manufactured. These eliminators can be manufactured and so forth on a homemade basis. But I recommend the RB3 because it's got a lifetime guarantee pretty much, and this one has provided me with over a decade of service with no trouble. I mean, the fellow who manufactured this thing out in Michigan is really awesome as far as the quality of his work. His name is Dave something. I'll see if I have his card available and show it to you. Here we go. This is Dave's card. It's, as you can see, Antique Radios Incorporated. Maker of the RB3. Hopefully you can get some information. Since he buys, sells, and repairs vintage radios. Great guy. I mean, awesome service. He has a collection of his own. Tombstones. No, not Tombstones. Atwater Kent breadboards, basically, which are themselves classic collector's items. And that's what I get. Now, of course, some sellers will offer you their own battery eliminators. I did that with the old Atwater Kent 20 from Atwater Kent 30 radio from 1926 that I no longer have, but that thing burned out pretty quickly. Hodgepodge of wires. So I don't recommend homebrews. I'd say if you're going to get a battery eliminator, RB3 is the way to go. Now, these things work, and they power sets prior to 1927 that were battery operated. That's their claim. That's the RB3's claim to fame, and it's the best in the business, I think. Now, of course, this collection is small, not much to it, but I like to think it's representative of a lot of radios of the past, different periods and so forth, and that's what I stick with. So you see here is a small room of my radio collection. What I like to do is to add period pieces. So what you see here is a picture from 1928 of an Atwater Kent 40 when it was new. I don't know who took this photograph. I just saw it on eBay one day and I picked it up. But it has the same radio, same speaker, and I think it adds to the ambience of the collection. What you have here is advertisements, vintage advertisements of radios. Atwater Kent's right here. Atwater Kent 20 down here. Atwater Kent 40. Again, the lighting is bad, so I apologize for that. Down here is a radio from a Philco 70. It's appropriate. And, I love radios, so obviously if I can get other items that remind me of them, that's great. And here, of course, is a 1925 ad for Eveready radios, for Eveready radio batteries. Now, why is this a part of my collection? Well, as a part of my collection, because I think it is important to create the ambience of the time. In other words, I like to get an idea of what it felt to live in a household with these old sets when they were new. And so key to that, I think, is getting contemporary advertisements, saying what they go for. It's also a good way of price comparisons. We think in terms of flat screen TVs and other items as being very expensive by today's standards. They're not. Radios at that time were far more expensive, especially those sets that came out in the 1920s, before the Great Depression. What you see here with the Philco 20 from 1930 was actually considered a bargain. It was an economy. And it went for like $50 minus the tubes. And $50 was a rather steep price to pay for anything in the 30s, especially the Great Depression 1930 itself. $50, man, it's like a week's salary of that. Maybe 2 weeks' salary, depending upon where you're working. And if you didn't work at all, you couldn't. It was way beyond reach. But this was considered a bargain. Philco 20 Cathedral, Baby Grand, they call it. So that's part of that was part of that. So keep that in mind. As for myself, I guess I'm just partial to cathedrals. And so, due to space considerations, monetary limitations, I decided early on that I'm just going to stick with what I liked. A lot of folks are into radios that sell for a lot of money, like Catlins or other type of sets or novelty sets. Why? Because other people do it and they pay big bucks for it. My opinion is if you're just going to go into this thing for the idea of making money and reselling, you're going to be disappointed because the values fluctuate. And today's fad may be tomorrow's junk pile. So yes, a Catlin of certain sets might be going for $2,000 or $3,000 now, but it's very possible that in a couple of years their value can drop to nothing, to zero. There's just no way to tell in advance. So it's important if you're collecting old radios and because of money and space, you were limited to a rather small collection, that you get what you like. It's important for these things to give off aesthetic appeal. By looking at the designs with this Crosley 168 or this Philco 70, you can tell that the designers made them had not only functionality but visual appeal in mind when they made them. An old radio is pleasant to look at. And when you have an old radio that not only looks good, but it works, well, that, in my opinion, adds to the appeal. And for a person on a budget, that is invaluable. So it's each his own on this thing. I would say that if you want to start collecting old radios, do it, okay? You can get about a dozen or so sets over a period of time, about $2,000 or $3,000, working sets, okay? And you can keep them working for a very long time, even if you're, like me, you're not really good at restoration, though I do have some tools. I'm teaching myself how to restore some sets. I'm not an expert, and I do it very reluctantly. But it's a nice hobby to have. And I found as a married person, when I got married, it was perfect because, being a radio collector, loving old radios, since my new wife was like, hey, you like radios? That means you can be content to stay home and not run out in the streets or hang out with your buddies. Well, she's right. My wife is never happier when I'm sitting listening to an old radio, listening to a ball game, which I do quite frequently. And one of the great things of having many sets is I rotate. So on a given day, like here on this side, I'll listen to a game, start with one radio, then switch over. And what I will do is I will basically synchronize the channels in advance. So after about an hour, I'll turn off one radio, turn it on the other, during a break in the action. And I do this several times a month. Keep the electronics going. I have a great time. My parents were both born in the 1920s, even though I came along in the 60s. And through them and my grandparents, who saw these sets when they were new, I developed an early appreciation of the actual listening to an event. Somebody said, I don't know who it was, when radios and television came out in the 40s, which do you like better, radio or television? And that person responded with a brilliant answer, and that was, I like radio better because the pictures are better there. And there's some truth to that, because with radio you can imagine what is happening. And for people like me, that actually improves the experience, because you can just paint a picture in your own mind's eye that often is far more colorful and more in-depth than anything you can see on a screen. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, the image in a man's or a person's mind is worth 1,000,000, I think, depending upon how fertile your imagination. And so if you're going to collect, put your own interests first. Radio collecting is, like most hobbies, a very personal thing. The only one you need to really worry about pleasing is yourself. The rest of the world will take care of it, do its own thing. But if you get into this hobby because you want to make a fast buck or because you want to impress other folks, you're going to be disappointed. So my thing is, if you're going to start collecting old radios, go to antique stores and so forth. Go to eBay, flea markets, radio meets. But get an idea of what you like first, okay? Now, I'm partial to a working collection, obviously, for the reasons I've mentioned repeatedly. You may just want a couple of sets for display. That is also fine. But I will say that having a working collection, a small working collection, gives you most bang for the buck. If you look at these large collections people have where radios are posted on or displayed on walls and so forth, or in storage areas, there's no way to plug them in, okay? There's no way to play all of them. And to me, that's just sort of like, after a while, it gets kind of old. I can only look at something so much, so often. But knowing that I can come in here and do what you see me doing here repeatedly, turning sets on and off, adjusting them to get a certain sound, a certain station, well, that just makes it special. But again, to each his own. So, to those of you who are contemplating starting a radio collection, I say go for it. In future videos, I will go into more detail as to what to look for. Of course, if you see a frayed cord on a radio, if you see missing tubes, the thing doesn't work. That's just obvious. Okay? And if you're going on eBay, some people will say that a working set is one that lights up. Well, let me tell you something. If a person says that a radio lights up, but you can pull in those stations, it doesn't work, because a working radio is just that. A working radio is a radio that you can listen to. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise, okay? That's the first thing. And the value of a radio, financially and aesthetically, is, of course, dependent upon not only the fact how it works, but how well it works, okay? Do your homework. Always do your homework. Know what is out there. Don't let somebody try to sell you something saying it's in the 1920s and you know it isn't. Some guy at an antique store said that a radio of his was made in the 20s. I took one look at the plastic cord and plastic casing. Said, this is an Air King, 1947. Blew his mind. That's what you do. Blow people's mind by showing them how smart you are and collect your radios accordingly. So have a good day, and God bless. Peace out.